We left off here with the upper respiratory tract in part one. So the external portion of our nose is mostly hyaline cartilage. You can feel it's super flexible. There's not a lot of actual structure to it. The nasal cavity, as I said, we have our nares, which are the nostrils, and then we have that travel up to what's called the choana. These are openings to the pharynx, and they're almost like little tunnels or caves that also is where our air can pass and get warmed and humidified. Our hard palate is the roof of our nasal cavity, and then we have our nasal septum, which divides it in half. So we said obviously it serves as a passageway for air. It remains open even when our mouth is full of food. So as we said, you can breathe through the mouth, but the nose is always a passageway for air. We have our hair cells that can trap and stop some of the debris coming in. And we also have a mucous membrane that can try to kind of act as a sticky substance to stop some of the debris. And then humidifying and warming the air so that our air matches our body's environment prior to getting all the way further in. We said olfaction was one of the functions. So it contains our olfactory bulbs, which end up connecting to our olfactory nerve, one of the cranial nerves that's responsible for smell. And it helps determine our voice and produce sound as well. They act as kind of hollow resonating chambers as we speak. The pharynx is our one that's in the respiratory and digestive system. We've said that a few times, so you can kind of key in on that. The nasopharynx is just behind the nasal cavity and right connected to the choana, and that's what just helps take in air. The oropharynx, kind of posterior to the mouth, is where or extends from the uvula to the epiglottis. The epiglottis is the piece of cartilage that covers up the trachea when we are eating or drinking so that we don't aspirate or get food or liquids into our lungs. And then the laryngopharynx, from that epiglottis just past that piece of cartilage down to the esophagus. And so food and drink can also pass through this part. So this is just before we transition to the larynx and trachea. So this is kind of the last portion where we have our common passageway. From here, we're going to have a split between respiratory and digestive. Our uvula is known as the little grape. It's just an extension of the soft palate, no real important functions. And then the pharyngeal tonsils are just one of our groups of tonsils, if you remember from chapter 14, and that's going to aid in defending against infection. So remember, our tonsils are kind of masses of lymphatic tissue. Don't go memorizing this entire kind of diagram here, but just take note of a couple of the things like our choana here, where we can warm some of our air in the different portions of the pharynx. The larynx is our voice box. It's anterior in the throat. It's going to go or considered the base of the tongue all the way to the start of the trachea, and it has 9 cartilages. One of the largest, or the largest, is the thyroid cartilage, and this is what's known as the Adam's apple, which is most prominent in males. And then we have the epiglottis, which is our piece of cartilage that prevents our food or liquids from entering the larynx. Here's just a diagram that shows some of the portions of the larynx, but you guys really aren't responsible for anything besides the thyroid cartilage and that epiglottis. You can see it forms kind of rings here as it starts to form the trachea. So we have 2 different types of folds, which are our vocal cords. So the vestibular folds are the false vocal cords. The vocal folds are the actual vocal cords that produce sound. So as air moves past them, they vibrate and sound is produced. And so how much air, the force of that air is what determines the loudness. And then the tension on the vocal cord is going to determine the pitch. So obviously we're kind of able to non-consciously or unconsciously think about increasing our volume or changing our pitch. So these are controlled with smooth muscle, even though there's a kind of a wiring in the brain of us thinking about, say, talking louder or talking with a deeper voice or a higher voice per se. Here's a diagram of what it looks like here, and then this is an actual kind of real life picture or video of a larynx. So that's with a laryngoscope or something that can view the larynx. So you can see we have our true vocal cords that lie here on the inside, and then we have the false vocal cords on the outer portion. All right, now we're moving into the lower respiratory tract. So that begins with the trachea, which is our windpipe. The trachea splits into a right and left bronchi. Our bronchi continue to branch. That's why they call it a tracheobronchial tree. So they branch out throughout the lungs. And then we have the alveoli. Remember, those are the sacs where we're going to actually fill those with air. Those have capillary beds on top of them, and that's where gas exchange occurs. Just another reminder here of our upper and lower. Okay, our trachea is the windpipe. We saw when we looked at the slide of the larynx that the trachea starts to form these rings of cartilage. They're going to be 16 to 20 total, depending on how long this said individual's trachea is, and we call those tracheal rings. They're lined with this ciliated, so cilia, kind of like little hairs, pseudostratified. So think back to the very beginning unit when we talked about the types of tissue. So pseudostratified, kind of two layers, not exactly, columnar epithelium. And so smoking actually kills the cilia on these columnar epithelium. And so that inhibits them from helping to clear debris and material. Coughing can help dislodge materials, but the cilia can help get that finer debris. So it's not good to have cells without them. So here's our trachea with its rings, our tracheal rings. The carina is this split here in the middle. We get our right and our left. And so this is why they call it the tracheobronchial tree, because we get a branching out just like a tree branch. And so if you remember back to our circulatory system chapter, as arteries and veins got smaller, we called them arterioles and venules. The same is kind of true for our lungs or our bronchi. So we have our main or primary bronchus that splits off into right and left. And then as they get smaller, we call them bronchioles. So we are also called them secondary, lobar secondary, segmental, tertiary. And then eventually you get to a terminal bronchiole, which is going to end in alveoli. But in general, as our bronchi branch off, they become bronchioles. So we have our right and left bronchi. They're lined with cilia as well to help clear debris, and they still have those C-shaped pieces of cartilage just like our trachea. And so this is how we go from largest to smallest here on our tracheobronchial tree. So we start with our primary bronchi. That's where we split on the right and left. The next group is our lobar or secondary bronchi. We then have our segmental or tertiary bronchi. We get smaller and smaller as we go along. So we get to the bronchioles next. These become terminal bronchioles. Our respiratory bronchioles have our alveolar ducts, which have a group of alveoli. So as we go from 1 to 8, our structures continue to get smaller, but we have more of them at each level. So we have 1 primary bronchi for each lung. We might have 3 secondary. We'd have 5 tertiary. So you get the idea. We keep adding and multiplying more and more and more. So our airways have the ability to change in diameter because they are lined with smooth muscle. So bronchodilation is when our smooth muscle relaxes. That's going to make the diameter larger. Bronchoconstriction is a contraction of that smooth muscle. That's going to make our diameter smaller. So an asthma attack is when we get a contraction of the terminal bronchioles, which means we're going to have reduced airflow to the alveoli, which makes a big difference because that's where the actual gas exchange is occurring. So oftentimes an inhaler and other medications to treat asthma are going to have some kind of compound that acts as a bronchodilator to open those airways back up. Our alveoli are the sites for our external respiration, or that exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between our alveoli and blood capillaries there and our environment, or breathing it in and out. So these are where the air is going to come in and actually fill. This is our respiratory zone. And we have capillaries that are laying right on top of each alveoli, so we can have that exchange between oxygen and carbon dioxide. So when we first take a breath in, we have a lot of oxygen in our alveoli. We have a lot of carbon dioxide in our blood because things like to go from high to low concentration or pressure. That's going to drive oxygen into the blood, and that's going to drive carbon dioxide into the alveoli. Then we can breathe that carbon dioxide back out into our environment. So this just goes a little bit more into how our bronchioles branch. So we have the terminal bronchioles, and so they're going to branch a bit further into respiratory bronchioles, which are going to have actual attached alveoli. These alveolar ducts and alveolar sacs are part of that alveoli. So this is kind of a super zoomed in view. This is our alveoli here. And then you see we have a capillary network right on top of that alveolus so that we can have a gas exchange occur between the blood and our lungs, or alveolus. So our respiratory membrane is that membrane between the capillary and the alveoli. So this is where our gas exchange is occurring. So this is a super thin membrane, which makes that gas exchange easy. And because it lays right on top of its surface, it tries to kind of maximize the surface area that's available for gas exchange as well, which makes gas exchange more efficient. Here's just a little diagram showing the direction that things are moving here. Nothing too much to see. All right, so our thoracic cavity is our upper cavity of the anterior cavities. So the diaphragm is our primary breathing muscle. That kind of forms the floor of our thoracic cavity. And so our diaphragm is the primary breathing muscle, but we also have a couple other muscles that we'll hit here soon that help us with breathing. So more or less what happens when we breathe in, our diaphragm drops down. So that's going to then increase space in our thoracic cavity. It decreases the pressure in there. We get air kind of pushed in from our external environment. As we breathe out, our diaphragm pushes up. That gets rid of the extra space in our thoracic cavity, and it helps push air back out. So we'll go through that a couple times. Our lungs house all of our respiratory bronchioles and alveoli, so they're our primary organs of respiration. They form a bit of a cone shape with the base or bottoms resting on the diaphragm, and then the apexes actually extend just above our clavicle or collarbone. Our right lung has 3 lobes. The left lung is a bit smaller because it has the cardiac notch for the heart, so it only has 2 lobes. A hilum is what we call this area where all of our pulmonary arteries and veins and bronchi enter. So if you remember back from our heart chapter, our deoxygenated blood on the right side of the heart is going to be pumped to the lungs. And so they're going to pick up oxygen, and now we have oxygenated blood for the left side of the heart. Remember, pulmonary arteries carry that deoxygenated blood from the right ventricle to the lungs, and then the pulmonary veins carry that back from the lungs to the left side of the heart. The pleural cavities are what we call the space around each lung, and the pleura itself is the membrane that surrounds our lungs. So our pleural membrane is a serous membrane. And so just like any serous membrane that we've discussed, it has two layers to it. So parietal layer is going to line the entire thoracic cavity, and then we have a visceral layer. And so visceral means organ. So the visceral layer is always directly on the surface of our organ, in this case, the lung. So we said before in our functions, ventilation is the actual process of breathing or moving air in and out of the lungs. So we have our muscles of respiration that are going to assist in changing the volume of our thoracic cavity. And then we have our air pressure gradients, or differences in air pressure between our thoracic cavity and alveoli, really, and our external environment that drive ventilation. So we're going to discuss this concept known as Boyle's law. And so what Boyle's law is that volume and pressure have an inverse relationship, an inverse relationship. So when something has a direct relationship, it means that change occurs in the same direction. If something has an inverse relationship, it means change occurs in the opposite direction. So pressure and volume have an inverse relationship. So when volume increases, pressure is going to be opposite, it decreases. Then vice versa, if volume decreases, air pressure is going to increase. Another important concept is that air is going to flow from the area of high to low pressure. So just like passive transport or diffusion, we're flowing from high to low. So when we're breathing in or during inspiration, our diaphragm is going to descend, our rib cage expands, and that means that we have an increase in our thoracic cavity volume. We just said that volume and pressure have an inverse relationship. So an increase in thoracic cavity volume means we have a decrease in our alveolar pressure, or the pressure in the thoracic cavity. So that means that now atmospheric pressure, or our external environment, is greater than alveolar pressure. We said we flow from high to low. So that means that air is going to move into our lungs and alveoli. So it flows from high to low, from atmosphere to alveoli. In expiration, the exact opposite is going to happen. Our diaphragm relaxes and our rib cage recoils. So our diaphragm is coming back vertical, back superior. So that is going to now result in a decreased thoracic cavity volume. So now we're going to get an increase in pressure. So think, as our diaphragm pushes up, our thoracic cavity is not getting any bigger. So pressure is going to begin to increase. At a point, our alveolar pressure is now going to be greater than the atmospheric pressure. And so air is then going to be pushed out of the lungs into the external environment. So we're still going from higher pressure to now lower pressure. We just flip-flopped. Here's a couple of our other accessory breathing muscles. So they don't do as much work as our diaphragm does, but they do help us or assist with moving the rib cage primarily. So here's just a few of the other accessory muscles to know that just assist in breathing. You don't have to know a whole lot about them outside that they're assisting. In people that struggle to breathe or have lung issues, oftentimes you can see what we call hypertrophy, or you can see these accessory muscles kind of popping out as someone's breathing because their accessory muscles are trying to help them get as much air in as possible. All right. Alveolar ventilation is how much air we're actually getting to be available for gas exchange per minute. So how much air is actually getting into our alveoli to be available to the capillary bed. So not all of our breath is going to reach the alveoli. So we have our respiratory zone where the air and gas exchange is occurring, and the alveoli or areas of the lung that do not get ventilated are called dead space. This is just kind of going through that pressure concept again. So during inspiration, our diaphragm contracts, it goes down, volume increases, and then pressure decreases. That brings air into the alveoli from the atmosphere. End of inspiration, nothing's happening. But as expiration begins, the diaphragm is relaxing, going back superior. That's decreasing our volume. That increases our pressure here. And now we're going to push air out. So some factors that are going to affect the ventilation rate is going to be gender, male versus female. So that also has to kind of go or relate to body size. Age is also going to affect this. So it's a muscle in terms of our diaphragm and our accessory muscles. So as our kind of bodies are not as strong, then same thing, our lungs are not going to work as well either. Fitness plays a large role in this as well. Just like any other muscle, you can train your lungs. You can't necessarily work out your diaphragm, but you can certainly work on your breathing techniques. And the more that you challenge your breathing and heart and lungs, your lungs can definitely get better at dealing with stresses. So this one's kind of tossed in here, but the concept or knowing what this material of surfactant is important. So surfactant is found in our alveoli and produced by the alveoli. It's a mixture of lipoproteins that forms this fluid lining or layer kind of coating on the surface of our alveoli. And so the job of surfactant, or the reason our alveoli secrete it, is to reduce surface tension. And the big picture of this is that it prevents our alveoli and therefore our lung from collapsing. So surfactant helps our alveoli withstand the changes in pressure that are occurring constantly as we breathe in and out without having an actual full collapse of that alveoli. You can think of the term partial pressure as kind of synonymous with the term concentration. We just use partial pressure for gases. So gas is going to diffuse from higher partial pressure to lower partial pressure, or higher concentration to lower concentration. So if it's high on one side and low on the other side, it's going to flow from high to low. So when we breathe in, we have a high partial pressure of oxygen in the alveolus, and we have a low partial pressure of oxygen in the blood. So the oxygen is going to diffuse across the respiratory membrane from alveolus to blood. Carbon dioxide has a high partial pressure in the blood, but a low partial pressure in the alveolus. So it's going to flow from the blood to the alveolus. So we just flow from high concentration or high partial pressure to low partial pressure. So at the lungs itself, this gas exchange is carbon dioxide from the blood to the alveoli, oxygen from the alveoli to the blood. At the body's tissues, it's oxygen from the blood to our tissue. It's carbon dioxide or the waste from our tissue to the blood. So as blood returns from our tissues, it just got rid of its oxygen and picked up carbon dioxide. So our blood's going to have a low partial pressure of oxygen and a high partial pressure of carbon dioxide compared to the alveoli. This means that our oxygen is going to go from the alveoli to the pulmonary capillaries, which is the blood, and the carbon dioxide will go from the capillaries to the alveoli. At the tissue level, we now have high partial pressure in the blood. That's going to drive oxygen from blood to tissues. We have high partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the tissues. That's going to go from tissues to blood to then come back to the lungs to continue that cycle. So oxygen and carbon dioxide are primarily transported through the blood. Oxygen is primarily transported by hemoglobin. A large majority is going to be bound to hemoglobin. Some is also bound, or some carbon dioxide is also bound to hemoglobin, but a majority of carbon dioxide is going to be transported as bicarbonate ions. And another reminder that the level of carbon dioxide in the blood is going to impact our pH. So we said a large majority of our oxygen is going to be bound to our hemoglobin within our red blood cells, and a small amount will be dissolved in that liquid component of blood. Carbon dioxide, on the other hand, we have a little more in the blood plasma itself, but only 23% is going to bind to hemoglobin. Most of it is going to be transported as bicarbonate ions within the red blood cell rather than bound to hemoglobin. But this is how we buffer that system. So we can transport bicarbonate without affecting the pH compared to if we had more carbon dioxide in this plasma portion. So just remember, this bicarbonate ion is how we transport carbon dioxide. And that is the end of chapter 15.